The first thing Bram Calder saw was not the girl. It was the paper. A single sheet lay on the brass scale inside Tilden Marr's assay office, held flat by a $20 gold coin. The paper had been folded and unfolded too many times. Mud stained one corner. The ink had run in places. But the words at the top were still clear enough. Bill of sale. Bram stood in the doorway with rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He had come down from the mountain for flour, salt pork, coffee, and percussion caps. That was all. Twice a year. He rode into Mica Flat, bought what he needed, ignored what he could, and went back to the Cedar Ridge before the camp found some new way to rot his patience. But this was not something a man could ignore. The assay office was packed shoulder to shoulder. Miners stood with wet hats in their hands. A few laughed under their breath. Others looked at the floor like the mud on their boots had become deeply interesting. Behind the scale stood Tilden Marr, thin as a fence post and dressed better than any honest man in Mica Flat. His black coat was dry, though every other soul in town was soaked. He had one hand on the ledger beside him and the other resting near the gold. Beside the wall stood a young woman in a flour sack dress. She did not look at anyone. Her hair was pale brown, wet from the rain, and tied back with a strip of blue cloth. Her face was thin, not weak, just used up in a way that made her seem older than she was. Her hands were held in front of her, not tied now, but close together like they remembered rope. Jeb Rusk stood near her, smiling too much. "There," Jeb said, tapping the paper. $20 clears my debt with Marr. And the girl goes where the paper says. Fair trade. Marr looked at the scale. It is not a trade until I mark the ledger. Bram stepped inside. The room quieted. Men in Mica Flat knew Bram Calder. They knew he lived alone above the timberline. They knew he came down twice a year and spoke less than a grave marker. They also knew he was not a man who enjoyed crowds. Jeb's smile slipped. You needing something? Calder. Flour. Bram said. This ain't the mercantile. No. Bram walked to the scale. Marr's eyes narrowed. This is private business. Bram looked at the paper. Private business don't usually need an audience. A few miners shifted. Jeb laughed once. Girl owes work. I'm settling accounts. The young woman's eyes lifted then. Only for a second. Bram saw no begging in them. No hope either. That was worse. He looked back at the paper. What's her name? Jeb shrugged. Mary Lark. The woman's mouth moved, but no sound came. Bram turned his head slightly. That your name? She swallowed. Her voice came out rough and small. Merci. The room went still. Bram looked at the paper again. Mary Lark. Not Merci. He turned to Marr. You were going to mark a woman into your ledger under the wrong name. Marr's face tightened. Names get written how they're given. And men like you call that law. Jeb stepped forward. Careful. Mountain man. Bram did not look at him. He reached into his coat, pulled out a $20 double eagle, and set it on the scale beside the first coin. The brass plate dipped. Jeb blinked. What's that? Bram picked up the bill of sale. I'm paying for the paper. Marr's voice sharpened. That paper belongs to the debt. Not anymore. Bram folded it once and held it out to Mercy. She stared at it like it might burn her fingers. Take it. Bram said. She did not move. So he placed it on the edge of the table. Close enough for her to reach and far enough that she did not have to step toward him. Jeb's face flushed dark. You bought her. Then. Bram turned to him at last. No. He said. I bought the lie with her name on it. The rain hit the roof hard. No one laughed now. Mercy slowly reached for the folded paper. Her fingers closed around it. She held it tight against her chest. Not like freedom. Not yet. But like proof that something had changed. Marr opened his ledger. This will bring trouble. Bram put his hat back on. Most true things do. He stepped toward the door. Then looked back at Mercy. I'm riding up before dark. You can come as far as the ridge. Or you can stay here and hand that paper to the sheriff yourself. Mercy looked from Bram to the men in the room. Then to the rain outside. Then down at the bill with the wrong name. For the first time, her hands stopped shaking. She followed him out. Mercy followed Bram Calder through the rain without asking where he was taking her. That worried him more than questions would have. Most people wanted a road named. A distance counted. A promise spoken. Mercy wanted none of it. She walked behind him through the mud of Mica Flat with the folded bill pressed against her chest and her eyes fixed on the ground. At the hitching rail, Bram tied his supplies to the pack horse. Flour. Coffee. Salt pork. A small sack of nails. He worked with slow hands, giving her time to change her mind. She did not. You got anything to fetch? He asked. Mercy looked toward the assay office. Jeb Rusk stood under the porch roof, watching them. Tilden Marr stood behind him, dry and stiff in his dark coat. No. Mercy said. Bram tightened the last rope. Then we ride. The trail out of Mica Flat climbed fast. The camp dropped behind them, with its muddy street, its crooked saloon sign, and the black smoke from the mine stacks. Rain turned thin as they climbed. Then it became sleet. Mercy sat behind Bram on the saddle. But she did not hold his coat. She kept one hand closed around the bill and the other around the saddle string. You'll fall if you keep that up. Bram said. I won't. You might. Then I'll fall. He looked over his shoulder. Her face was pale with cold. But her eyes were clear. Bram faced forward again. Stubborn. He thought. Good. The first snow came before they reached the cedar ridge. It moved through the trees in hard little flakes, tapping against Bram's hat and Mercy's shoulders. She did not complain. She did not ask to stop. Once, when the horse crossed a narrow wash, her hand brushed Bram's coat. She pulled it back, like touching him had burned her. He said nothing. Near dusk, the cabin appeared between the cedars. It was low and square, built from dark logs, with a sod roof and a stone chimney. No smoke came from it. A split rail pen stood to one side. A chopping block sat near the door, half buried in old snow. Bram got down first. He tied the horse, then turned. Mercy had already slipped from the saddle. Her knees bent under her. But she caught herself on the stirrup and stayed standing. Bram noticed. He did not offer his hand. Door's there, he said. It ain't locked. She looked at the door, then at him. Why not? Nothing worth stealing up here except cold. Mercy did not smile. She went inside. Bram took care of the horse before he followed. He rubbed the animal down, stacked the supplies under the lean-to, and gave the wind time to clear his temper. He had done a foolish thing in Mica Flat. Maybe a right thing, but foolish just the same. When he stepped into the cabin, Mercy was standing in the middle of the room. She had not touched the chair. She had not gone near the bed. She had not opened a shelf or taken off her wet shoes. She stood there with water dripping from her dress onto the dirt floor. Bram lit the lantern. The cabin came to life in pieces. A black stove. A rough table. One chair. One narrow bed. Shelves with tins. Rope. Dried beans. Coffee. And tools. A saddle blanket folded near the stove. A small Bible no one had opened in years. Mercy's eyes moved over everything. Then they stopped on the door. Bram saw it. There's a latch inside, he said. No lock outside. She looked at him. You can bar it when I'm gone, he said. Why would you let me do that? Because a door that only opens one way is a trap. She held the bill tighter. Bram turned to the stove and started the fire. He kept his back to her while the kindling caught. There's a dry shirt in that chest, he said. Blanket too. You can change behind the hanging hide. Mercy did not move. He added another stick of cedar. Or stay wet and shake all night. Your choice. The words were rough, but the choice was real. That seemed to trouble her. At last, she crossed to the chest. Bram kept his eyes on the stove until he heard the hide curtain move. A few minutes later, she came out in one of his old flannel shirts. The sleeves rolled 3 times. The hem nearly to her knees. She still held the bill. Bram set beans to warm in a pan. Mercy watched them like a person watching money being counted. When he handed her a plate, she did not take it. "I haven't worked," she said. "You rode half frozen up a mountain. That is not work for you." "It is tonight." She took the plate then. Slowly, she sat on the floor near the stove. Not in the chair. And ate in small careful bites. As if making the food last proved she deserved it. Bram sat by the door. The wind pressed against the cabin walls. After a long while, Mercy spoke. "What are the rules?" Bram looked at her. "Rules? For the bill." Her voice stayed flat. "For food. For sleeping. For when winter gets worse." His jaw tightened. "There are no rules for the bill." "There are always rules." Bram stood, crossed to the table, and pointed to the folded paper in her lap. "That paper stays with you. Not in my chest. Not under my floor. With you." Mercy stared up at him. He pointed to the bed. "You sleep there." "Where do you sleep?" "By the stove. And if food runs low, we eat less. And if that is not enough." Bram's voice dropped. "Then I go hungry first." For the first time, Mercy had no answer. Outside, the storm thickened around the cedar trees. Inside, Mercy slipped one hand into the pocket of her wet dress, lying near the stove. Her fingers touched the hidden $20 coin she had taken from the mud. She did not tell Bram. Not yet. Mercy woke before Bram the next morning. Or maybe Bram had been awake and was only pretending not to be. He lay on the floor near the stove, one arm under his head, his coat pulled over his chest. The fire had fallen low. The cabin was cold enough that Mercy could see her breath. She sat up on the narrow bed. For a moment, she did not know what to do with quiet. No one shouted. No one pulled her by the arm. No one told her the price of breakfast before she earned it. That made the room feel more dangerous. Not less. So she worked. She put wood in the stove. Too much. Smoke pushed from the seams before the fire settled. She swept the dirt floor with a stiff brush. Then she found a bucket. Packed it with snow from outside. Melted it. And tried to wash the floor clean. By the time Bram opened his eyes, the cabin was hot, wet, and full of steam. He sat up slowly. Mercy was on her knees near the table, scrubbing at the packed dirt like she could rub the whole mountain flat. "What are you doing?" Bram asked. "Cleaning. It's a dirt floor. I can see that. You can't clean dirt." Her hand stopped. She looked down at the muddy water spreading under the brush. Her face went pale. Like she had just failed some test no one had explained. "I'll fix it," she said quickly. Bram stood. "No. I made it worse. I'll fix it. Merci." She froze at her name. Not Mary. Merci. Bram crossed the room, took the brush from her hand, and set it on the table. "You don't owe me a clean floor. I owe you food. You ate beans. I owe you the bed. It was empty. I owe you the shirt. It was in a chest." Her mouth tightened. "Then what do I owe?" Bram looked at her for a long time. "Nothing today." She did not seem to understand that. He could have said more. But Bram was not made for speeches. He took the bucket, opened the door, and threw the muddy water outside. Cold air rushed in and cut through the heat. Mercy wrapped her arms around herself. Bram came back in and set the bucket down. "If you need work, there's socks to mend, buttons to sort, beans to pick clean from stones. Work that doesn't wear you down for no reason." She looked toward the bed, where the folded bill of sale sat under her handkerchief. "It is not no reason," she said. Bram heard that. He did not answer. For the next week, Mercy worked like the cabin might throw her out if she stopped. She kept the fire steady. She folded everything twice. She counted the beans. She patched a tear in Bram's coat so neatly he stared at it for half a minute before hanging it back on the peg. But every time he found her doing too much, he gave her something smaller. Not easier. Smaller. A person could survive small things. One afternoon, while sleet tapped against the shutter, Bram sat at the table cleaning a broken hinge. Mercy sat near the stove, cutting carrots with a dull little knife that bent more than it cut. She pressed too hard. The carrot slipped. Bram looked up. Mercy pulled her hand back fast and hid it in her lap. He said nothing about it. Instead, he reached to his belt and took out a short knife with a pale bone handle. He stood, crossed the cabin, and held it out to her. Handle first. Mercy stared at it. It cuts cleaner, he said. Let the blade do the work. She did not take it. A knife in my hand does not worry you, she asked. If I worried about every sharp thing in this cabin, I'd sleep outside. Her eyes moved from the blade to his face. Slowly, she took it. The knife looked heavy in her hand. But when she set it to the carrot, it went through clean. She looked at the cut piece as if it had told her a secret. Thank you, she said. Bram nodded and went back to the table. That evening, a rider came up through the snow. Bram saw him first through the gap in the shutter. A thin man on a tired horse, wrapped in a brown coat, with a leather message pouch under one arm. Mercy stood at once. Bram reached for his hat. Stay inside. She did not like the order, but she obeyed. He opened the door just wide enough to step out. The rider handed him a folded paper sealed with dark wax. From Sheriff Abel Knox. The man said, Mica Flat wants that bill brought down. Tilden Marr says it belongs to the camp ledger. Bram's face did not change. And Jeb Rusk? He asked. The rider looked away. He's talking plenty. What's he saying? That you bought yourself a winter woman. The words entered the cabin even with the door half closed. Mercy heard them. Bram turned his head slightly. Just enough to know she had. He took the letter and gave the rider a small coin. The man left quickly, glad to be away from the ridge before dark. When Bram came back inside, Mercy was standing beside the stove. Her face was still, but her fingers were tight around the bone-handled knife. I should go down, she said. No. They are speaking against you because of me. They were speaking before you. They just found a new shape for it. The sheriff asked for the bill. The sheriff asked. Marr demanded. Mercy looked toward the folded paper on the bed. My sister's name was Ada, she said suddenly. Bram went quiet. Mercy kept her eyes on the fire. My father said she owed less because she was smaller. Bram's hand closed around the sheriff's letter. Mercy looked up at him then. So tell me, Bram Calder, if the law kept a ledger for her too, would it have written her name right? Outside, the rider's tracks were already filling with snow. The snow stopped 2 days later. It did not mean winter was gone. Bram knew that. The mountain liked to lie in small ways. A clear sky. A softer wind. A trail that looked open from the cabin door. Then it would take a man's foot out from under him. Mercy stood near the table, folding the shirt she had mended for Bram. The stitches were small and tight. Better than anything he could have done himself. He watched her hands. They were steadier now. That should have pleased him. Instead, it made the weight in his chest worse. On the bed lay the bill of sale. Folded once. Kept where she could see it. Just as he had promised. Near it sat the sheriff's letter from Mica Flat. The bill had to go back. The question was whether Mercy should go with it. Bram had spent half the night staring at the stove, thinking of every answer and liking none of them. By noon, he went to the chest for fresh socks and found Mercy's wet dress folded at the bottom. Something heavy rolled from the pocket and struck the floor. A gold coin. $20. Bram stared at it. For a moment, he thought it was his own. Then he knew better. His coin had gone on the assay scale. This one was marked by mud in the rim. Dark in the grooves. Mercy's coin. The coin from Mica Flat. She had carried it all this time. She had held enough money to bribe a driver, buy a place on a stage, or disappear before the deep snow closed the trail. And she had said nothing. Bram bent and picked it up. It felt heavier than gold should. Mercy came in from the woodpile with her arms full of split cedar. She saw the coin in his hand and stopped. Neither of them spoke. Bram closed his fist around it. You had this? Yes. Since the camp? Yes. You could have told me. I could have. His jaw tightened. Why didn't you? Mercy set the wood down slowly. Because I needed to know what you would do without knowing I had it. The answer cut colder than the wind. Bram looked at her. You were testing me. I was surviving. Those words should have ended the argument. They did not. Bram set the coin on the table. Road may hold by morning. Mercy's face changed only a little. For what? For you. She went still. Bram forced himself to keep speaking. Sheriff wants the bill. Marr wants trouble. Jeb's talking. The longer you stay here, the worse it gets. The worse it gets for you. For both. Mercy looked at the gold coin. So you are sending me down. I am giving you a way out. That is a prettier way to say it. Bram's voice roughened. You have money. You have the bill. I have a horse. You can reach Mica Flat. Then, take the stage west. And you. I'll bring the bill to Knox once the next thaw holds. Mercy looked at him for a long time. You found the coin and decided I should leave. I found the coin and remembered you can. That is not the same thing. No. Bram said. But it may be the only decent thing I can do. Mercy turned away first. She picked up the folded shirt from the table and placed it on the back of the chair. Then she took the bill from the bed and tucked it inside her coat. I will be ready by morning, she said. Bram wanted to say her name. He did not. That night. Neither of them slept much. The cabin was quiet in the hard way. No anger. No shouting. Just two people lying on opposite sides of the room. Both pretending the fire needed watching. Before dawn, Bram saddled the horse. Mercy came out wearing the flannel shirt under her coat. Her hair was tied back with the same blue strip of cloth. She carried no bundle except the bill and the coin. Bram noticed she had left the mended shirt on the chair. He also noticed she had fixed the torn cuff of his old coat while he slept. Neither of them mentioned it. The trail down was slick with half-frozen mud. Bram walked beside the horse and let Mercy ride. She kept her eyes forward. After an hour, the cabin was gone behind the trees. After 2. Mica Flat smoke appeared low in the distance. Then Bram saw a shape near the trail. A man stood beside a dead pine. Hat pulled low. Coat patched at both elbows. Jeb Rusk. He smiled when he saw Mercy. Well now. Jeb said. I wondered when the mountain would spit you back down. Bram stepped in front of the horse. Jeb's eyes moved to Mercy's coat pocket. You still got what belongs to me. Mercy's hand closed over the hidden coin. Bram heard the small sound of paper shifting under her coat. The bill. The gold. The wrong name. All of it had followed them down the mountain. Jeb Rusk stepped closer, smiling like a man who had already won. Bram did not move. The trail was narrow there, with a steep drop on one side and wet pine roots crossing the mud like black ropes. The horse shifted under Mercy. Uneasy. That bill still carries my name, Jeb said. And that gold came from my hand. Mercy looked down at him from the saddle. No, she said. It came from the mud. Jeb's smile faded. Bram turned his head slightly. Ride on. Mercy tightened the reins. But Jeb stepped into the horse's path. Sheriff's waiting in town, he said. More too. They'll want to hear how a mountain man took what wasn't his. Bram reached for the horse's bridle to lead Mercy around him. That was when the ground gave way. It was not much. Just a strip of wet trail breaking under Bram's boot. But it was enough. His shoulder struck the slope hard, and he slid down into the brush below the trail. Mercy heard him hit the lower bank. Then, silence. Brum. Jeb looked over the edge and let out a low laugh. Mountains got poor timing. Mercy got down from the horse. Her hands shook, but her voice did not. Move. Jeb looked at her. You giving orders now? Mercy stepped around him and climbed down the bank. Bram was caught against a fallen cedar. One arm pressed close to his side. His face had gone gray with pain, but his eyes were open. Can you stand? She asked. Not quick. We do not need quick. Above them. Jeb spat into the mud. Town's the other way. Mercy looked up. Then go tell them we are coming. Jeb stared at her. For the first time, he seemed unsure what to do with her standing straight. He left them there. It took most of the afternoon to get Bram back to the trail. Mercy used the horse, rope, and every hard lesson the mountain had taught her. Bram tried twice to take command. Twice she told him to save his breath. By sunset, they reached Mica Flat. The church bell was already ringing. Not for Sunday. For judgment. The small wooden church stood at the far end of the street, its white paint worn thin by wind and coal smoke. Men gathered outside with wet hats in their hands. Women stood near the steps. Sheriff Abel Knox waited by the open door. Inside, Tilden Marr had placed his mining ledger on a table before the pulpit. Jeb stood beside him. He had arrived first. Of course, he had. Bram leaned hard on Mercy as they crossed the street. Every eye turned toward them. The town that had watched her be measured in silence now watched her walk in with the man they were ready to blame. Sheriff Knox looked at Bram. Calder. Marr says you took property tied to a debt. Mercy stepped forward before Bram could speak. No. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. She took the folded bill from her coat and laid it on the church table. Then she placed the $20 coin beside it. The sound of gold on wood was small, but every man in the room heard it. Marr's mouth tightened. That coin belongs against Jeb Rusk's debt. Mercy looked at him. Then read the name. The sheriff picked up the bill. His eyes moved across the page. Mary Lark. He said. Mercy lifted her chin. That woman does not exist. The church went quiet. Jeb shifted. It's close enough. Mercy turned toward him. It was close enough when my sister was taken. It was close enough when you wrote my name wrong. It was close enough when men looked away because paper was easier than truth. Bram stood behind her, breathing hard, but silent. He wanted to help. For once. He knew helping meant not stepping in front of her. Sheriff Knox looked at Mercy. State your name. Mercy Lark. And did you agree to be entered in this ledger? No. Did Bram Calder claim you as property? Mercy looked back at Bram. His face was tight with pain and fear he could not hide. No. She said. He bought the paper. Then he gave it to me. Marr opened his ledger. A camp cannot run if debts mean nothing. Sheriff Knox looked at him. A camp cannot call itself lawful if a person is written down like a mule. A few miners lowered their eyes. And if you had stood in that church, with the ledger on one side and Mercy Lark on the other, what would you have believed? The clean ink? Or the woman finally speaking her own name? Mercy picked up the coin. My father sold my sister for less than this. She said. Jeb tried to sell me for this. Bram thought paying it could end the matter. She set the coin back down. It does not end until my name is mine. Sheriff Knox closed the bill in his hand. Marr. He said. Bring your stamp. Marr did not move. Outside. Thunder rolled over Mica Flat. Mercy kept her hand flat on the table, beside the wrong name, waiting to see whether the town would look away one more time. Tilden Marr looked at Sheriff Knox. Then he looked at the men standing in the church doorway. For the first time since Mercy had known him, Marr did not look certain. His black coat was still clean. His hair was still combed. His ledger was still open on the table. But the room had moved away from him. Bring the stamp. Sheriff Knox said again. Marr's jaw tightened. You are making a mistake. No. Knox said. I am correcting one. Jeb Rusk took a step back. Mercy saw it. So did Bram. Sheriff Knox opened the bill of sale and set it flat beside the mining ledger. He pointed to the name written there. Mary Lark is not standing in this church. He said. Mercy Lark is. Marr said nothing. And no camp paper can bind a person who never gave consent. A low murmur moved through the room. Not loud. Just enough. Marr finally took the stamp from his leather case. He pressed it into the ink. Then brought it down hard on the bill. Void. The word sat across the paper in dark letters. Mercy stared at it. That paper had followed her from the assay office to the mountain. From the cabin to the trail. From fear to fear. It had carried the wrong name. But it had still weighed on her like iron. Now, it was only paper. Sheriff Knox turned the ledger toward Marr. Cross the entry out. Marr's hand was stiff when he took the pen. He drew a dark line through the debt entry that had tried to hold Mercy's life inside a column. Then Knox turned the ledger toward Mercy. Write your name. Mercy looked at the pen. Bram stood behind her. One hand braced against the table. His face was tight with pain. But he stayed quiet. He did not reach for her. He did not tell her what to write. That made it easier. Slowly. Mercy wrote. Mercy Lark. The letters were uneven. But they were hers. Then she placed the $20 coin on the table. This paid for a lie once. She said. Let it pay for the next woman who needs a stage ticket out of this camp. Sheriff Knox nodded. I'll see it recorded. He looked at Marr. Before sundown. You will post notice outside the assay office. No person is to be entered in your ledger as debt property. Not by name. Not by mark. Not by any paper carried through your door. Marr's face hardened. But he did not argue. The town was watching now. And that mattered. Jeb Rusk tried to slip toward the side door. 2 miners stepped into his way. No one raised a hand. No one needed to. Sheriff Knox looked at him. Jeb Rusk. You and I have business at the office. County judge will want to hear how many papers like this passed through your hands. Jeb's mouth opened. Then closed. For once. He had no price to name. Bedusk. The rain had stopped. Marr's notice hung outside the assay office. Nailed crooked beside the price board for ore and mule feed. Men stopped to read it. Some looked ashamed. Some only looked angry. But they read it. Sheriff Knox came from his office carrying a folded paper. A clean stage pass. He said. Good for Boise. Helena. Or any stop west, your money reaches. Name is written proper. Mercy took it. There it was. Mercy Lark. No wrong letters. No debt mark. No man's name above hers. The stagecoach waited near the depot. Wheels sunk deep in the mud. Its driver was already tying down the last trunk. The door stood open. Mercy walked to it. Bram did not follow too close. She stood there with the pass in her hand. Looking at the empty seat inside. For months. Maybe years. That was all she had wanted. A road away. A name on paper. A chance to vanish before someone priced her again. The driver looked down. You writing? Miss. Mercy looked back at Bram. He stood beside the church steps. Leaning on his cane. Saying nothing. That silence mattered. He was not sending her away. He was not asking her to stay. For once? The choice belonged to her alone. Mercy folded the pass and put it in her pocket. Not today. She said. The driver nodded and shut the stage door. A few minutes later. The coach rolled out of Mica Flat. Carrying dust and mud westward. Mercy watched until it disappeared around the bend. Then she turned back. Bram's eyes met hers. You should have taken it. He said softly. Mercy stepped closer. Do not do that. What? Do not decide freedom from me just because you are afraid of holding me. Bram looked down. Mercy's voice stayed quiet. I know where the road is now. I know my name is on the pass. I know I can leave. She touched the folded paper in her pocket. That is why coming back means something. They rode up the mountain slowly. The trail was wet. Bram could not sit straight for long. So Mercy walked beside the horse on the steep parts. One hand on the bridle, the other holding the folded bill. When they reached the cabin, the sky was turning pale over the cedar ridge. Bram opened the door. The room was cold, but it did not feel empty. Mercy crossed to the stove and placed the voided bill inside. She did not light it right away. She only looked at it through the open iron door. Then Bram took a small nail from the shelf and fixed the clean stage pass to the wall beside the table. Not hidden. Not locked away. There for her to see every morning. Mercy turned to him. You are still not going to ask me to stay. Bram's hand rested on his cane. Not while you still need to know you can leave. She stepped closer. I know. Outside. First light touched the wet porch boards. Mercy took a match. Lit it. And touched it to the paper in the stove. The old bill curled slowly in the flame. The wrong name disappeared first. Bram stood beside her. Silent. Mercy hung the mended flannel shirt on the peg next to his coat. She had not come back as payment. She had not come back because a paper told her to. She came back with a pass on the wall. Her name in the town record. And a road waiting below the ridge. Down in Mica Flat. The church bell rang once in the morning air. Up on the mountain. The cabin warmed. And Mercy Lark, who had once been priced by a coin, stood by the fire with her own name. Her own road. And her own choice. If this trail stayed with you, leave your thoughts for Dust Trail Stories. Some debts end on paper. Some lives begin when the paper burns. This is a fictional story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.